Okay, so let's get started. Welcome everyone to this webinar on man-in-the-middle attacks in the mobile channel. We're very pleased to welcome you to this. So the context for this, of course, is the massive deployment of mobile apps is presenting new attack surfaces to bad actors, and the channel between the apps and the APIs is one of those attack surfaces. We talk about the threats in another webinar, which you can find on the approved resources page. But today we're going to focus on that mobile channel. And encrypting traffic is just not good enough. The good news is that there are techniques and tools to protect the channel and to eliminate man-in-the-middle attacks, but they're not really broadly implemented across the industry. And we'll talk a little bit about that and why that is. And we'll also talk about how you can take steps and how we as a community can take steps to eliminate this threat completely. So I have two colleagues here who are going to go through this. So Richard Taylor is the CTO and co-founder of Approve, and Skip leads the US team for the company. And Richard's going to kick us off, and he's going to talk about the introduction to the man-in-the-middle attacks in the mobile context and certificate pinning and how that fits in. Then we're actually going to do a demo of a pinning tool, which we've made available to the community for free, which really helps you set up the configuration. And Skip's going to take us through that. We'll talk about some of the issues with pinning and how you address those. And then we'll have a Q&A. So in the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. And so feel free during the presentation to put your questions in there, and we'll make sure that we keep time at the end to cover those questions and get them answered. And then if you hang on to the very end, you will find that we have actually a special offer for you. So do stay to the end of the presentation. With that, I think I've covered all the logistics, so I'll hand over to Richard now, and he'll kick us off with a discussion around man-in-the-middle attacks. Thanks. Over to you, Richard.
Okay. Hi, welcome everyone. So as a sort of first step, I'm going to talk about what a man-in-the-middle attack is. And the expectation here is that you've got a mobile app, and mobile apps nowadays always use transport level security for talking to back-end API servers, so indicated by the padlock there. So the communication itself from the mobile app to the back-end server is actually encrypted and is safe, and that's the intended communication channel. But what we mean by a man-in-the-middle attack is that it is actually possible for somebody, some person to insert themselves into that channel. So in TLS, there's a whole protocol around ensuring that the mobile app thinks it's talking to a legitimate back-end server, but a man-in-the-middle can insert themselves, and actually then the mobile app talks to the man-in-the-middle actor over an encrypted channel, thinking that's the back-end server, and then the man-in-the-middle can seal the traffic, potentially modify the traffic, and then transmit that on again over an encrypted channel back to the back-end service. There are a couple of different variants to this. There's a variant when it's genuinely a man-in-the-middle that has no access to the mobile app. And there's also a variant where the man-in-the-middle might also be controlling the app as well, or controlling the environment that the app is running in. So when a communication is made from the app to the back-end service, part of the TLS protocol uses public key infrastructure to prove that it believes it's talking to the right server. So essentially what happens is that there is a certificate that is on your server that's part of an overall trust chain that proves the legitimacy of this particular server, and that actually belongs to the person you say it belongs to. Actually, you are the person controlling that domain, and therefore you're the person who can put a server onto that particular domain and serve traffic. And the way that works is using public key infrastructure. So essentially during the negotiation, a number of different certificates are presented and are checked basically by the client to prove that they are correct. And this basically follows a trust chain, as sort of shown on the left-hand side there, that ultimately needs to lead to a root certificate authority. And the anchor point really in terms of the trust is the fact that there are a number of certificates which essentially pre-installed and updated on the mobile device itself from certificate authorities. And you only accept the traffic if you have a trusted chain leading there. So the way that trust chain is actually implemented is that in order to get a certificate for a particular domain, you basically need to go to a certificate authority or some intermediate, and there may be a number of intermediates in the chain, and basically prove to them that you actually own this domain. And if you can basically prove that, then they will use the private key corresponding to their certificate to basically sign your certificate and then kind of link the bits of the chain together to ultimately prove that you own the domain, and therefore you can stand up a server on that particular endpoint. So basically the leaf certificate, which I'm showing here at the bottom, is specific to the particular domain. Now, there are a couple of ways that this trust chain can be subverted. I'm going to talk about one way, which is essentially what happens if you use a man-in-the-middle tool, of which there are many. So this is a kind of the case where you're actually controlling the device. So this might be a case where you're actually analyzing traffic from a mobile app. Then you're controlling the device. And there are these various tools like MitM Proxy. And part of what those tools do is that they create a certificate that is then installed onto the end user device. But this is, rather than being a certificate from a root certificate authority, this is actually a self-signed certificate, effectively, that the tool is made up. You install it into the trust store on the device. And then when the tool intercepts traffic, it basically on the fly will create leaf certificates for the particular domains that you are visiting, which have a chain of trust back to its sort of self-signed certificate authority that's on your device. And so when your device tries to connect to that particular domain, you've redirected the traffic to the proxy rather than actually going to the server. Everything will check out because basically, as far as it's concerned, it's got a chain of trust to something which is trusted on the device. And then basically from there, the proxy tool will then connect to the real server, allowing the traffic to continue. But actually, there's this proxy in the middle that's seeing all the traffic. You can replay the traffic, and you can modify the traffic if you want. And that's typically one of the things that's done if you're trying to analyze an app from the point of view of building some kind of script to basically impersonate your app, for instance. Now, it must be said in recent years, unless you control the end device, it's actually quite difficult now to sort of accidentally install one of these self-signed certificates on your device. There's been a lot of additional protections put in both Android and iOS to prevent people being tricked to install one of these certificates so that a man in the middle is possible without controlling the device. So this is typically a technique which is used for analysis when you control the end user device. The other way that you can break the trust is if there is actually a breach of certificate authority or a bad issuance of a certificate. Now, so one of I suppose the weaknesses of the whole kind of PKI architecture is the fact that there are actually a large number of root certificate authorities that are installed on the device. And really, if any of those are broken, if there's a breach in any of those, then that could lead to a situation in which a certificate for a domain that you're connecting to could have an attacker certificate incorrectly issued. So basically, the trust is only as strong as the weakest link there. So what could happen is there could be a data breach, or perhaps more likely is that there could be sort of a failure or some kind of circumvention of the process that's used to prove that you are actually the owner of a domain. And normally the way this happens is that you have to put some kind of record in your DNS record to prove that you own the domain, or perhaps some kind of tag on the website content to prove that you're actually controlling it. So it could be a breach or a kind of insider attack on the certificate authority side, or it could be a breach of your own systems in terms of being able to control DNS. Is one possibility. And then once that happens, if somebody, for instance, on public Wi-Fi is able to then redirect DNS, so rather than going to the official server, it goes to a server with this incorrect certificate installed upon it, then as far as the app is concerned, it wouldn't really know the difference. It thinks it's legitimate traffic, and then basically end user traffic would be directed at this attacker's API endpoint. So what can we do about this? Well, one solution which is used and has been quite widely employed in mobile apps is pinning. And you'll find that a lot of very security conscious apps, banking apps, etc., do kind of routinely employ pinning, but it's not completely across the industry. So essentially what pinning is doing is basically providing an additional check. So in addition to all the normal analysis which is done on the certificate chain during the negotiation, there is an additional step put in. So if you can, here you can see the relationship between the device on the left-hand side and then the back-end service. So the server is serving a particular certificate, and ultimately then during the negotiation, there'll be a trusted chain from that lease certificate to some certificate authority. And that certificate authority needs to be a trusted one, and therefore it needs to be in the device's trust store for the connection to happen. And normally that's sufficient, but it means that the app in that case is really sort of relying on what's installed on the device, and it doesn't entirely control that, especially if the app is running on a hostile device. So what pinning does is basically put an additional check by putting a pin of a certificate inside the mobile app itself. So in addition to the normal checks, you need to also need to see a certificate which is pinned. Normally, but not always, this is a leaf certificate. It could actually be a root certificate or an intermediate, as I'm going to talk about in a moment. It's not necessarily and usually not a copy of the entire certificate. It's actually a hash of the certificate. But essentially it means as the app is shipped, it includes this pin within it, and will only connect if it sees the correct certificate. So you're not just relying on the trust chain, you're actually saying, I want to see this particular certificate, which I know is my certificate. Anyone else who generates a certificate for my domain is not going to get through. And the reason why this is perhaps easier and more widely implemented on apps is that there is this kind of secure channel through the App Store of releasing the app code, including this configuration. There have been attempts in the past to have certificate pinning on the web, HTTP pinning, but that sort of suffers from multiple problems. One of which is really that the only channel that you can get the information across for the pins is the channel that you want to pin. So there's not really an independent way of getting the pinning information across, so it leads to all sorts of potential attacks against it, which are not possible with this kind of channel of publishing the mobile app. So there are two types of pinning. We're actually talking about, I'm sort of describing this as certificate pinning, although technically that's not what the pinning is. It's actually public key pinning, which is a much more popular way of implementing pinning. So essentially, the difference is that you have a certificate which has many fields, some of which are shown here, like serial numbers and how long it's valid for, etc. And ultimately the kind of signature of the certificate authority or the next authority up in the chain. And you can take the entire certificate content and you can produce a hash of that. So basically you're looking to see that that particular certificate is being presented by seeing this kind of unique hash value. So basically a hash takes all the content and generates a much smaller number, which is difficult to fake. Or typically the way it's done in mobile apps nowadays and supported by the frameworks is subject public key information hashes, where basically you take the algorithm and public key information and you hash that bit. and that produces a pin value. So the main advantage of that is that it means that you're not actually pinning to a particular certificate, you're pinning to a particular public key, which means that if you renew the certificate, as long as you keep the public key, if public and private key is the same, then the pin won't actually change. So you can keep rotating without constantly having to change pins in mobile apps, which, as we'll talk about later, is one of the disadvantages of pinning, is this need to kind of rotate the pins. Okay. So if you are pinning, you basically have a choice of what you want to pin. And we'll cover this in a bit more detail when we talk about our tool. But you know, there are choices and trade-offs, as with most things. So one option is that you can pin to a certificate authority, well, basically the root certificate authority, which is basically not saying that you are pinning it to a particular end certificate for your server. What you're saying is that I will only accept certificates which have come from this particular certificate authority, signed by this particular root certificate. So that has the advantage that that's much less likely to change, because these certificates are much longer lived. But what it's actually doing is restricting connections to be from a particular certificate authority, not necessarily to a particular domain. So it's not in security terms, it's not quite as strong as pinning to a leaf certificate, but practically that might be the better trade-off depending on your circumstances. But of course, the pin can change if you kind of decide to move servers and go to a completely different infrastructure and you change your certificate authority, then the root certificate will change. You can pin to an intermediate certificate. Some larger organizations have intermediate certificates internally from which they sign their own server certificates. This has, pinning an intermediate means that you're pinning something which is a bit longer lived, perhaps server certificates. Or ultimately you can pin to the leaf certificate, which is definitely the most secure, because you're saying it absolutely must be the certificate that I see. But of course, good practice says that you should rotate your certificates reasonably regularly. So make sure that if you are rotating them, that you are retaining the same public private key, unless there's an emergency where you need to change it, or else you're going to keep needing to change the pins. And you also have to be aware that if you're down to individual servers, sometimes in particular infrastructures, there might be different certificates for different geographic locations, and you need to be sure that they are all using the same key pair, or otherwise you need to include all those pins in your mobile app, which is difficult to manage. So in terms of implementing pinning, most of the networking stacks available for native apps and for various other kind of development frameworks have some means to pin. They're all quite different in general. Some of them are quite cumbersome to use. As we'll talk later, we have some integrations for all those kind of different networking stacks. But one of the things which kind of emerged more recently is basically a common platform way of doing pinning that covers most, maybe not all, but most of the networking stacks that you might be using inside your mobile app. So Android has actually had this since Android 7. So this is essentially some configuration you can put inside an XML file, a bit like the manifest for your app. And this basically defines pins that you will accept for connections from the mobile app. So you can see here on the left-hand side, this is a sort of syntax. So you kind of create this file, you put it inside your app. You don't actually need to modify the code of the app. And you sort of specify the particular domain or domains that you want to pin against. And then there's basically a list of pins that you want to pin against. It doesn't specify where in the chain those pins are. Basically, it's happy if that particular hash turns up anywhere in the chain. If any one of those turns up anywhere in the chain, then that is considered to be a good connection, as long as it passes all the other TLS checks. And interestingly, more recently, iOS have also introduced a similar sort of feature, but it's only since iOS 14, so it's relatively recent. But of course, iOS users tend to upgrade much more frequently than Android. So that represents quite a high percentage of the user base. And it's a completely different XML syntax, but essentially doing the same thing, where you specify pins for particular domains. However, getting the pin information is quite cumbersome, as we found out ourselves. So, I mean, if you look at the instructions, you tend to have to issue quite long strings of OpenSSL commands, generate files of all sorts of different certificate formats in order to be able to extract the right pin from a particular certificate file. So it's really not very user friendly. And you have to do this kind of thing for every single pin that you want to include for each domain. So it's a bit laborious, and it doesn't really help you with the process of actually generating the exact format for the XML file. And there are also various complications with converting between the various different formats that you might have certificates in. So you might need to kind of get a certificate and then change between different types of formats, etc. So this is the area where, in terms of pinning, we feel we can contribute because of work we've done previously on Approve. So we've kind of implemented this tool, and I'm now going to hand over to Skip, and Skip is going to kind of talk about man-in-the-middle attacks and then provide a demonstration of this new tool.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and steal the screen here. Okay, does everyone see the approved website? So we'll go ahead and talk about min in the middle. So first I want to just kind of review briefly what we saw from Richard in terms of how the TLS connection is negotiated. So for the demo, we're just going to be running a simple shapes app that talks to a shape server and asks it to return through an API call a random shape. So like all modern apps, it's going to be communicating over HTTPS or using a TLS connection. So as Richard said, one of the first steps in the handshake there is let's send a certificate over so that the device can guarantee that it can trust that the shape server is what it says it is. So it'll walk up the certificate chain, check its trust store until it finds a matching certificate so that it establishes the trust and the identity of the shape server. When a man-in-the-middle attack takes place, the man-in-the-middle is going to try and get in between the two connections. And normally a connection would be encrypted through, so there's not much to see here unless you can establish some kind of trust within the device. So one of the first things that the man-in-the-middle attack will do when it's getting set up is it will try and poison the device trust store, as Richard mentioned. So it'll stick in a certificate, and we've already done that for the emulator that we're going to be running our Android app on. So then when the Shapes app makes a request to the Shapes server, the man-in-the-middle will intercept the request. It will then start the TLS connection, send over a certificate which says, trust me, I am the Shapes server. It will then walk up the trust store and will find, yes, in fact, there is a certificate which will vouch for that up its certificate chain. So then this connection can be encrypted and decrypted. The man-in-the-middle can observe and manipulate all the traffic. It can easily make a connection with the shape server similarly, pass traffic through, intercept, read, replay. And it's basically, this is a very common hacking technique that's used to establish how APIs work, what credentials are being used, what credentials can be harvested here. So typically a hacker, since they control the device, will go ahead and poison the trust store and set this kind of scenario up. So we'll be using a MitM proxy or man-in-the-middle proxy, which is open source code in the demo, and we'll run that through. How do you block this? We will show actually using our certificate pin generation tool, how to generate a pin and how to actually easily integrate it into an Android or iOS app. Once the pin is in the app itself, we're still going to see a presentation of a certificate chain. It will walk through the device store and the device will say, yes, I do trust this. But now the shape will actually say, well, do I really trust this? And it will go ahead and check and see, is this a certificate I have seen before? So if this pin is here, then the app itself will extend trust and believe that the shape server is what it says it is. So in this case, man in the middle will come in and we'll demonstrate how it's going to have already poisoned the store. It will send its certificate in. The device trust store will say, yes, the device trusts that this is the shape server. But the shape app will say, hey, hang on a second. This does not look like a certificate I've ever seen before. So I refuse to accept this, and it will refuse the connection. And therefore, the man in the middle is unable to get in the middle and actually extend the chain all the way between the two. So now, if everything goes well, I'll walk through a demo of this. So I'm going to start by just demonstrating the basic Shapes app. So this is a simple Android app we have running. It's talking to a shape server and it's pulling random shapes out. Well, hopefully they're random. There we go. A few random shapes. So I have my MitM proxy running over here in this large black window here, and I'm going to go ahead and insert the proxy in between my shape server and my emulator here. So now, when I go through and get the shapes, you can see I'm collecting information here. I've actually inserted myself in between and I'm monitoring what's going on. And if I look at one of these, you can see here's the request coming in. It's a simple request to the shape server asking for a shape. And it is got a query parameter here called the secret is approve your API. So if that was a secret credential that I wanted to harvest, I could go ahead and harvest that information. In this case, we're just monitoring what's going on. We're learning how the API works, what a successful API call would look like. We can go further with this if we want, and we can go ahead and manipulate this traffic. So I'm just going to restart this. And I'm going to now add some code that's going to manipulate things as we go through. So now, let me just set this up so you can see it. All right, so now I'm going to get my shape. And as you can see, I am still snooping the packets up here, and I've let this shape go through. But every third time through, I'm going to intercept the shape and manipulate it a little bit. So instead of getting a recognizable shape, you're getting a picture of the man in the middle guy. And we're reflecting your secret here that you sent to us. So again, one, let go through. So this is sort of emulating a low-level attack where I don't want to intercept everything, but I want to manipulate things periodically. So what do you do about this? Well, obviously what we want you to do is pinning. And pinning has somewhat of a bad rap. As Richard mentioned, it didn't go so well for browser-based kind of pinning implementations. They were pretty vulnerable to attacks. So they work well on Android and iOS devices. So we have actually tried to take a lot of the complexity of getting all this pinning information through. So we've just released a pinning tool. It's on our website. If you go to resources, and oops, sorry, and you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's a bunch of quick starts and things you'll go through, and then you can bring up the tool itself. So this is a pinning generator tool that will generate what you need to insert into your Android and iOS apps. So the domain for my shape server is called shapes.approve.io. I'm going to want to go ahead and pin the subdomains. You could or could not here. It just means if there's more subdomains beyond shapes, it would go ahead and pin those as well. I'm going to choose to pin the leaf certificate. You could choose to pin the root certificate instead if you wanted to. As Richard mentioned, this is the most specific one that you can pin. And what's really important is that this is a static pinning service. It's a simple service. So if this pin, if this certificate were, say, to expire, and you don't have another certificate in your system, then your device is no longer going to accept connections, even to your valid shape server, because it no longer has a certificate that you recognize. So it's very important to try and always add a backup pin into your system. So usually we'll have generated a set of certificates. You'll have received PEM files when you generate them. So we're just going to go ahead and choose a backup pin. This is my alternate pin here. So I'm just adding the cert in. So now from this information, I could go ahead and generate. I'm just going to add another domain. If you have more domains to add, you could go and do this and go on. You could add as many domains as you wanted your app to be able to pin against. So we're going to go ahead and now submit both of these. Let me hit the submit button. And you can see here's the results. This is for shapes.approved.io. This is the certificate chain starting from the lowest level one. You'll see it's shapes.demo.approved.io. There's an alternate name for this same server. It goes through an intermediary pin from Let's Encrypt, finally up to an X1 root certificate. So that X1 root certificate is something that's known to the device that you're using. We also have our backup pin here. Here's the alt cert PEM, and here's the actual signature or fingerprint for this one. And then down here, this is the approved.io domain information. So on Android, as Richard said, there is an XML file. You would add this in. And on iOS, there's a plist file, info.plist, that you would go ahead and add these through. So I'm going to go ahead and work the Android example. So here is the here's my main activity file. Here's the manifest. The manifest actually has a pointer to network security configuration. That can typically include more than just the pinning. I just have it blank here right now. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this information here and overwrite it. So now we have our pins in, and I'm going to go ahead and, oops, sorry. Zoom is getting in my way. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my running app, and I'm going to go ahead and recompile it. And then here's my demo, and here's my system here. So now when I run get shape, the man in the middle is still attempting to intercept. So we'll go through, and you can see down here briefly, it's saying that the client TLS handshake has failed in red. You can see that on the Android application itself, it's saying the pin verification has failed. So we have successfully pinned this and kept the man in the middle attack out. The man in the middle will then eventually give up and we'll withdraw since they can't get anywhere. And now the question is, will this pin be recognized if we're going to go all the way to the shape server? And indeed, what you can see is we're actually now running a pinned connection. So in addition to the trust store validating that this is a valid certificate, the app itself is saying, yes, my pin recognizes that this has the correct signature. So we're good to go. Now, one issue with this is a simple static pinning. If you were to only rely on one pin, in this case, the leaf certificate here, and that pin were somehow to get corrupted in some way, we just changed to those, and we're going to go ahead and stop and rerun this. And go ahead and communicate now back to the shape server. You can see, unfortunately, that the pin verification is failing because the certificate that's being expected is not have the proper signature. This would also occur if a certificate is expired potentially. You would not get through. So it just shows that there is a maintenance thing. You really do need to be diligent to make sure that you have backup pins, that you use common public key signing as you go through. And I think Richard will talk about this a little bit more. So again, the easy way to get started here is to just go in, enter your domains, make your decisions. Please add your backup pins, hit the submit button, and you'll get your results. Cut in your Android, cut in your iOS, recompile, and you should be good to go. So with that, I will turn it back over to Richard.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the risks with pinning, Skip was talking about, and some actual ways you can still bypass it. So obviously, as Skip was saying, the risk here is that, well, if the pins no longer match your real endpoint, then you have a problem because your app no longer works. So you can no longer communicate with your service, which effectively means your app is down. So you can get yourself out of this situation by issuing an app update, sorry, with some changes to the pins, but that's not a quick process. That could take some days. and during that time you have a major problem, and you can't really be absolutely sure that everyone is going to update their app. So it's quite useful if you have some kind of messaging inside the app if there are pinning failures to indicate that you might want to do an update. But really you need to make sure this doesn't happen. And the things to avoid really is that you must never pin a domain that you don't control. So don't pin to an API endpoint where you're not controlling the server, or you're not controlling whoever is responsible for rotating the certificates, because they at any point can change their certificate chain, and your app is no longer going to work. If you have auto renewal on certificates on the endpoint, then you really want to make sure the public key is maintained to save you having to change the pins. But of course, you may, if there is some kind of breach of your private key, have to change pins. So if your private key is compromised, that's why you also need a backup pin, as Skip was saying, so that you can put that into service should you need to rotate to a completely different key pair. And you just need to be aware of that you need to coordinate basically between the front end and the back end teams to make sure that the certificates don't change in a way that you didn't expect. And you might also need to, if you are about to rotate the certificate, you can do it by putting the new pin into the app sometime before you're going to rotate. So ideally, many days or possibly even weeks before you're going to rotate, you have the new pin and the old pin in the app. Basically, you need a well-defined process. So this pinning technique is very effective if you're just looking at man-in-the-middle attacks where the attacker doesn't control the end device. However, if an attacker controls the end device and they're basically doing some kind of analysis on your app, then there are still ways that you can bypass pinning. There are a couple of ways. First way is that both on Android and iOS, although perhaps it's slightly easier on Android, you can basically repackage the app. So basically you can download an app. There's a tool called APK tool, but there are other tools as well that basically decodes the contents of your app. You can go in and you can edit the pins. You can change that configuration, or if the pinning is implemented inside the code, then you can change the code, and then basically you can rebuild the app and then run the modified version of the app, and you can change the pins or you can remove the pins. So how susceptible your app is to that depends on how hardened it is. And you can't just assume because you've obfuscated your app that necessarily it will be protected against that. The other way of attacking it is sort of a runtime attack. So if you have a rooted or jailbroken phone, there are various types of frameworks, Frida being the most well-known and popular, that basically allows you at runtime to hook certain functions running inside an app and modify the behavior. And actually, one of the kind of major use cases for these types of frameworks is to basically undo pinning. And if you so basically Frida has various modules, kind of open source modules that you can use. And if you kind of search for their open source modules, like the number one with the most number of users, it's basically a sort of universal SSL pinning bypass. And basically that's kind of an enormous script that looks at all the different ways pinning is actually implemented in the stack for different types of networking stacks, and basically inserts changes to the code at runtime to make sure that the pinning isn't active. So this is an example I pulled out. This is for OKHTTP, which is basically looking at the Java class OKHTTP certificate pinner, and then a particular method inside that is being modified. And basically what this is saying is that rather than run the code you normally run, just basically run a stub that doesn't do anything. Presumably the way the function works normally is if there's a pinning failure, then it blocks or it throws an exception. So basically once that's running, the pinning is disabled in the app. So there also needs to be another layer of protection to really stop pinning bypasses. One kind of side issue I wanted to kind of talk about is there is also, as well as pinning, there is a sort of an emerging solution that's kind of widespread in use in browsers, but less so in mobile apps so far. But I'm sure in future years this will become more prominent. And this is a kind of solution called certificate transparency. So basically, this is saying that every time you issue a certificate, you need to make sure that it's issued on a public log. So this doesn't. This kind of is to deal with the issue of some kind of breach and the certificate being issued against your domain. So that it doesn't necessarily stop that happening. But what it's saying is that any certificate to be valid, if you enable this particular feature, must be provably in the public log. So the idea is that you can basically monitor this public log, and if a certificate turns up that you don't know anything about or wasn't issued by you, then you can put some mechanism in place to essentially to block communication using that certificate. The certificate transparency doesn't do that side of it. It basically provides what it says on the tin, which is basically the transparency. So the way that works is that the public log servers basically provide a signed certificate timestamp when a certificate is issued, which basically proves that the issuance of the certificate is now public and on the logs in a way that can't be revoked. It's a bit like a kind of blockchain thing where you basically can't revoke it after it's been issued. And this SCT is then transmitted alongside the certificate information as part of the protocol. So this is an interesting area that it's implemented on iOS, not entirely built in on Android as yet, but in the future, this might be one of the other solutions to preventing man-in-the-middle attacks. So what I'm going to talk about now briefly is how all this sits with Approve. I mean, obviously, we've been working in this area for a number of years, and that's how we have the sort of technology which we've now put into this free tool. But I'm going to talk about what Approve is and its kind of solutions to these problems. So I'm not going to go into all the details of what Approve does, but essentially it's a sort of SDK and cloud service which is used to protect the integrity of your system that's running outside of your backend service. So that includes both the integrity of the app, so proving at runtime the integrity of the app, proving the device integrity, especially in terms of making sure there isn't a framework or like Frida running on the device, and also checking the integrity of the communication channel, which is really where the pinning aspect comes in. So Approve is always built in pinning into the way it works, but actually we have a mechanism which enables dynamic pinning, which I'm going to talk about. So the way this works is, in addition to the trust store that we've talked about on the device, we also have a mechanism where we can pin certain certificates on certain domains. But rather than this being a fixed resource file or a change to the code, this is actually something which is basically a configuration file that can be changed live inside the app. So the idea is that there's this SDK, there's the Approve SDK that runs inside the mobile app, and that SDK is responsible for talking to a cloud service that we run. And part of the information that is transmitted from that cloud service is what we call a kind of dynamic configuration. So this dynamic configuration includes the domains that your app is using and the pins for those domains. And this can basically be updated dynamically. So there is basically a way that you can change the pins at will on the server side, and then that is then communicated back to individual apps that are running. So it completely avoids the situation where you might end up having some static pins in a mobile app, and due to circumstances beyond your control, you end up with the app not working because the pins don't match. In this scenario, you can update the pins at any point. And in fact, we also, as part of the way Approve works, we do continuous monitoring as well of the endpoints. So when you add a particular domain that you want to pin to Approve, we set up a continuous monitoring process. So we're basically pinging that domain from our servers on a very regular basis, looking at certificate chain and making sure it matches the pins which are inside the app. So if they have changed, then you get immediate notification, allowing you to then push out an update to your apps. In order for this to work securely, we we have to have a mechanism to basically communicate this to the app. And obviously one of the challenges here is that the pins on our service could also change as well. We want to be able to change our certificate chains. So we don't simply rely on the fact that our communication is pinned and therefore we can provide configuration to the app. We have actually a scheme where each individual approved account holder actually has a public-private key pair. So there's a public key which goes inside the app as part of the setup for the configuration of the SDK. And we hold the private key. And basically when a configuration needs to be updated, it needs to be correctly signed with a private key. So we can basically transmit an update for pins over an unpinned channel, and the SDK itself will only accept that if it's correctly signed. So basically we're proving that this is an update that's actually coming from the approved service. It automatically updates the pins, and the way our integration works, it means that automatically your app will be updated to the latest pins and start working again. One of the other things that Approved does is, because it is also doing this kind of device analysis and app analysis, it also prevents pinning bypass in the way I just talked about. So one pinning bypass, as I said, is that you could modify the app to change the pins. That is actually detected because part of what Approved does is looks at the integrity of the app. And the other method is that you could use some kind of hooking framework. That's also detected because we are looking for hooking frameworks that are running in the environment. So the way that works is that the SDK sort of behind the scenes is gathering information about what's going on, sending environment measurements back to our cloud service, and then that is sending a very short-lived token back to the app, which then sends that particular token to back-end APIs. And if the environment measurements don't check out because the app's been changed, or there's an instrumentation framework running, or various other things, then we won't send a validly signed token back. And this means that the back-end API checks the token and will know that there is a bypass in place. So basically it knows that there's a man in the middle, and won't perform any further communication with the app. So you might get transmission which has been bypassed, but it's one way. Basically the API will then not send anything back because it has detected that and has blocked it. And I suppose one of the drawbacks of the static configuration using the platform integrated mechanism is that is only available particularly from iOS 14. Whereas the way we've implemented dynamic pinning is we've basically looked at the mechanisms in each HTTP stack and implemented something which automatically adds the pinning. And this goes right back to Android 5 or even earlier in some cases, and iOS 10. So we've got kind of complete coverage across a large number of different frameworks that you can see here, and going back right to very early versions of Android and iOS. So the actual pinning itself is open source, but where the pins come from is from the approved SDK. But if you look at our kind of quick starts, which are on GitHub, you can see how that pinning is actually implemented, which is actually quite a useful resource if you're looking to implement pinning on a particular framework, but don't want to use the networking built-in mechanism because you're worried about the level of operating system support. Okay, so that's it from me. So I'm going to now open it up to any questions.
Thank you, Richard. That was great. So we've got a little bit of time and we have a few questions here that are coming in. So let me see. Actually, I think you touched on this, but this is a question about the free tool. Actually, there's two questions concerning the free tool. So the first one is, which versions does it support? Of which versions of iOS and Android does the tool support? I think you mentioned that, but you might want to.
Yeah, so iOS 14 and above for Apple, and Android 7 and above.
Okay. And then another question that's related to that is will Approve keep it up to date? Will this tool be kept up to date? Is that the kind of, I guess, the commitment?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't imagine this format is going to change radically, because obviously that will break existing apps. But I mean, obviously we'll closely monitor what's happening, and if there are additional features are added, then we will update the tool to make use of those additional features.
Okay. And then there's another one here, which is how can I find out if there's a man-in-the-middle attack on my apps? How can I see that?
That's tricky. It depends how it's done, but in general, you can't tell if the traffic is coming from a proxy or it's actually coming from your app. There might be in some circumstances, but it's not entirely reliable. I mean, you can look at there are ways of fingerprinting TLS to see what type of stack is implementing it, and that might be slightly different with a proxy, but it's not entirely reliable. Especially if you're doing the man in the middle by modifying the app, then you really are running in the standard mobile environment. That's if you're using static pinning. If you're using Approve, you get the signal because essentially you will see that certain apps are failing our Approve checks, and they might be failing with free detected or something like that, or the app has been modified, and that's all shown in our metrics, so you can see individual devices and the fact that that's actually happening.
Okay, so if you run a Approve trial, you would get information about that. You would be able to find out pretty quickly.
Yeah,
that would be
absolutely.
All right. So again, this is more of a broad question, which is, pinning's not implemented in my environment, but so how would I get started to be able to implement it? I guess it's more, what would be the overall steps to take?
That's good.
So sure. So that's exactly the reason we provided the certificate pinning generator, was to try and take as much of the guesswork out and to lower the bar to get into this. So with now both Android and iOS offering the ability to sort of declaratively specify the pins, we've just added a tool that will generate exactly the information you need to cut in. So with that in play, just take your existing iOS or Android apps, and go ahead and fire up the tool, and you can read the documentation associated with the tool, go through, and it really is as simple to get started as generating a file, copying it, and pasting it in as I did in the demo. As Richard said, we certainly will be enhancing this tool over time. The format itself is pretty stable, so I don't think there'll be a lot of changes there, but I think we will be enhancing the documentation as more people use it and bring back questions. That's probably where we can put in some more value.
Okay. All right, we're coming up to time here, so maybe if we just talk about the special offer we've got and move on to the next slide. Yeah, so of course there's a free trial for Approve, and you can go to our website and find out all about that. And we have a special offer for you if you do sign up for a free trial, and Skip's going to explain a little bit more about what that is.
Yeah, so if you're interested in trialing Approve, by all means do. It's free for 30 days, no credit card needed, and you get people like Richard and I to talk to help you through your support questions. But in addition to that, if you're still with us after all this webinar, when you sign up for a trial, if you enter that code pinning webinar in the additional information box, which you will see when you sign up, then you will get some additional attention where we will go through and work with you on a checklist that we've established over time working with other customers on how to best deploy everything out so everything goes smoothly and you maximize your security. So we will consult with you on how to use security policies. It's not something we touched on here, but with security policies, you have the ability, say, to block all rooted devices or not block them. So if you're a bank and you don't want to allow rooting to exist when you're on your device for your app, then turn it on. If you're a gamer and you rely on rooting, then you can go ahead and pass it through. We'll consult with you on the best way to enhance the security on your front end. We'll take a look at your back end. We'll go through all the pinning with you. Excuse me. We like to double check your testing strategies and how to best test the security and test without security as you go through. We've got a lot of experience with that. And there's a bunch of other things on that checklist. So if you're interested in sort of a broad overview pre-deployment, then by all means sign up for the trial and get started with us.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I'd just like to thank the presenters today, Richard and Skip. And I'd like to thank everybody who's attended the webinar.
Can I jump in for a second, George? I did also want to say that a number of people worked on this tool, but I wanted to give a shout out to Paulo Renato. He's one of our experts on our team who put together the certificate pinning generator tool. So thanks to Paulo as you guys use this.
That's great. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. So the webinar's now over, and thanks again.